There are places on Earth that have climates that are not compatible with life, at least not for long. These places are so dangerous to inhabit that if someone faces an emergency, there will be no rescue coming to save them. The same even goes for their bodies. There are actual places that if a person dies, their body will likely remain forever. Despite knowing this information, it still doesn't stop the ultimate adrenaline junkie from exploring them. Mount Everest, located between China and Nepal, is one of those places. It's especially unique because its high altitude, coupled with the deadly cold weather, helps to keep the bodies of the dead pretty pristine. Their clothing breaks down a little over time, but their entire bodies remain well preserved for a while. Their bodies do still decay, but at a much slower rate. So bodies who have died even over a decade ago often appear like they just recently stopped to take a rest and fell asleep. Though Mount Everest is technically not the tallest mountain in the world, its peak is the highest altitude above sea level. All the way up there, oxygen molecules are much farther apart. Every breath in only allows for about 22% of the amount of oxygen that you would get at sea level. It's simply not enough for our cells and organs in our body to survive. Because of this, climbers often opt to make the climb with supplemental oxygen. For especially daring devils, they go without, but they know that they cannot spend that much time in the death zone. That means their trek to summit has to be made as quickly as possible. The whole expedition takes months. It's about 80 miles or 129 kilometers from base camp to summit and back, but climbers don't just head straight there. They have to give their bodies time to acclimate to the treacherous cold and high altitude, so they basically head up and down, slowly going a little farther each time. As for the temperatures, they are always bleak. The warmest it ever gets is about 10 degrees, and that is a rarity. It's often closer to a range of -25 to -40 and worse. In addition to all of that, Everest sees some wicked winter storms with even lower wind chills, hurricane-like wind speeds, and avalanches that can snuff out even the most seasoned climbers. There's a stretch of Everest known as the Death Zone, which is believed to be home to over 200 dead bodies. This is the area where rescue will not bother to come help you, and your body will likely never be recovered. It's simply too dangerous. Expeditions to remove bodies have led to even more deaths. There have been a couple of successful retrievals, but it costs a pretty penny to have it even attempted. Upon entering the death zone, your body will begin to die cell by cell. One climber who survived his trek said it felt like running on a treadmill at full speed, but only breathing through a straw, and that was with supplemental oxygen. If you have any pre-existing heart or lung disease, forget about it. Once the oxygen levels in your blood begins to fall, your heart rate will speed up and grow erratic. This isn't helpful in situations where anxieties are likely already peaked. Your body will also begin to produce extra hemoglobin to try and compensate for the lack of oxygen. This can thicken your blood too much and lead to a fatal stroke. There are honestly just so many risks. The high altitude can also lead to severe fluid buildup in your lungs. This will further hamper your ability to breathe, and it can also happen to your brain. This can cause severe vomiting, dizziness, and even can induce a type of psychosis. Of course, we cannot forget about good old-fashioned hypothermia. Those temperatures are wacky. It wouldn't take long. You could grow fatigued and sit down for a rest and simply never wake up again. Not all of the bodies have been officially identified or even discovered yet. There are several people who vanished, some during horrible storms who have never been located. It's pretty obvious at this point that the mountain claimed their lives. We just don't know how or where. One of the identified bodies has finally become nicknamed Sleeping Beauty. She gained the nickname because she appears as if she's simply just sleeping. Her real name is Frances Arsentive, and on May 22, 1998, she became the very first American woman to reach the summit without the help of oxygen. What makes this story especially haunting is a terrible nightmare that her 8-year-old son had just before she departed for her expedition. He woke up in a cold sweat, very distraught, and went on to recall the events of the dream. He saw 2 climbers surrounded by a sea of white snow. They were completely trapped. There was no escape. This disturbed him so much that he begged both Frances and his father to not leave the following day for the climb. Frances consoled him and reassured him that it was just a dream. She also said that she couldn't wait and it was something she just had to do. Frances wasn't a professional climber, but it had grown into a large passion. She met and married her husband, who was very well known in the Russian climbing community. It was something that brought the couple closer together. Frances had already scaled just about every single mountain in America and often spoke about her desire to one day conquer Everest, which she did. Tragically, she just didn't live to tell the tale. Nobody really knows exactly what led to her unfortunate fate. Only the few who crossed her path could shed a little light. One couple happened upon her in her purple jacket. Of course, she looked like she was sleeping, but the pair knew that finding such a thing in the death zone was an ominous sign. They assumed that she was already dead or in a coma. As they got closer, they recognized her. They had met her at base camp. They remembered meeting her with her husband, only she was now completely alone. Suddenly, she began to speak, which startled the couple. "Don't leave me. Why are you doing this to me? I'm an American," she frantically uttered. She continued to say the same words over and over as if on a loop. She was clearly in a really bad state and very close to death. The couple could see advanced stage frostbite taking over her cheeks. Her skin had a waxy appearance, and the non-frostnipped skin was snow white. It's unclear what her words meant. Maybe nothing at all. She was clearly not operating with her full mind. Telling them that she was an American was possibly a way for her to identify herself. Climbers from all over in all different countries came to scale the deadly mountain. She may have simply been trying to alert them to which group she was with. Tragically, there was nothing that the couple could do for her. Any amount of help that they could have offered could have easily resulted in their own deaths. This is perhaps a part of climbing Everest that few talk about, the trauma of happening upon a dying woman and knowing that you cannot do a thing for her. Her body began violently spasming, and the two knew that it wouldn't be long for her. Eventually, other climbers also crossed paths with Frances, but after death had come for her. They hypothesized, based on her location, that she had taken a serious fall. Unable to move, she fell victim to hypothermia. Sometime later, her husband surfaced at base camp and was absolutely frantic about losing his wife. Somewhere in the descent, the pair had become separated. When he arrived and she was not there, he knew that something terrible had happened, but he was advised to wait for her in safety. The weather had been very unpredictable since they began their descent, and it wasn't safe for him to go out looking. He waited around for a few hours, but eventually said to hell with the advice. Against better judgment, he went back out into the abyss of the death zone. But who could blame him? Nobody ever saw him alive again. It wasn't until almost a year later when his body was discovered. He appeared to meet the same fate as his wife. It looked like he too suffered a bad fall and died to hypothermia. Another body that has been given a nickname has never officially been identified. There's a pretty widely accepted hypothesis of who it is, though some people still contest it. I am talking about Green Boots. Green Boots was a climber who had on fluorescent green boots, and after he died, he acted as a landmarker in the death zone. Up until 2014, climbers knew once they reached him, they were getting close to the summit and peak. His body was inside of a limestone cave, and it told the story of his death. He was close to the peak, grew exhausted and likely frostbit, and decided to sit down to gather his strength. Of course, we know that's a big no-no in the death zone, but sometimes the body just gives out and can't go on. He fell asleep and never woke up. In 2014, he was moved farther down the mountain and away from that regularly trafficked area. The most popular theory on his identity is that Green Boots is actually an Indian climber who died during the infamous and deadly blizzard of '96. That storm was wicked and only left one lone survivor from his expedition group. He was spotted on the mountain prior to his death wearing a very similar pair of fluorescent green boots. In 2006, seasoned climber David Sharp tragically became his neighbor. David was an experienced British climber who had already attempted to conquer Everest several times. This time, he wanted to make it a true challenge, so he opted to go it alone and without the help of oxygen. Once he happened upon Green Boots and that limestone cave, he was suffering from painful frostbite on his appendages and face and likely severe exhaustion. Without that oxygen, his cells were shutting down. Everything in his body had to work so much harder. I am sure that he saw that cave as a small reprieve from the blowing winds, like a mousetrap filled with a beautiful meal. I imagine that he told himself, just a very short rest and then back to it. A while later, another group of climbers reached the cave. They found David perched right next to Green Boots. He had his knees bent, with his arms stretched around them. His eyelashes had tiny little icicles dangling from them. The members of the group began shouting in hopes of rousing him, but he was unresponsive. They believed that he was already in a coma or dead, so they moved on. Minutes later, a different group also discovered him inside of the cave. They reacted the same. They shouted and tapped him to see if he was still alive. This time, David moved. He waved them off but remained completely quiet, almost like a teenager who refuses to rise for school in the morning. Knowing what I know about death and hypothermia, I imagine that David was in a state of complete exhaustion. Not like the exhaustion we feel after a rough work week, but the kind that strikes just before death. It may appear like that person has lost their will to live, but that isn't the case. This is an exhaustion that blankets your whole being. It makes you want to go to sleep forever. It can't be helped. And sleep is the enemy when in that state. There are several other groups of people who claim to have crossed paths with David. Some said he was completely unresponsive, and some said that he moved a little. Either way, he was in really bad shape. We really don't know how long it took for death to finally come and wrap its cold fingers around him, but it did come at some point. Green Boots was no longer alone. That is, until the bodies were moved years later. It is hard to know the exact number of bodies that are scattered around the death zone, but the figure is believed to be around the 300 mark. In recent years, climate change has unearthed even more bodies. Ice sheets are melting at a more rapid pace, giving birth to the occasional hand or limb of past climbers. Between 2017 and 2019, 10 brand new bodies have emerged, and experts wouldn't be surprised if this continues to happen. Some legs and arms have even been revealed near base camp. There could be a day when almost all of the missing become found, and that day could be soon.